Hi guys, welcome back aboard good old Athena. This week I have a fresh supply of plywood and some foam insulation. So this week it's finally time to finish our aft cabin. But wait, there is more. I know a lot of you guys become violently ill at the sight of these two unseemly gaps here at the nav station. So this week I'll also take a stab at spiffing up the nav station. We only have about another 3 weeks left up here on the hard before we go back in the water, so it's maybe time to put our best foot forward and get a bunch of tasks started. So we have finish aft cabin and paint under the companionway trim. We have paint under the galley plus head shelves, and we have charging area doors. Let's get started on all of those. Whoops-a-daisy, and of course the nav station task. That is a lot of tasks, so fingers crossed. My name is Mess, this is my wife Ava. I've spent the last 5 years on a somewhat extensive refit of our 1987 Warrior 38 named Athena. That was a DIY fun-packed adventure complete with a very extensive osmosis treatment, building a new rudder using vacuum infusion, rebuilding the entire deck, gutting and subsequently rebuilding most of the interior, painting the top sides, and a ton of other projects. The summer of 2021 we started cruising full time. Now we're finally ready to begin our adventure. As is the case with many a cruising boat, our aft cabin is a giant mess and mainly used for storage. Right now it is cramped full because of sails and other stuff. Fortunately, while we're up on the hard, I'm showering in the yard, so we can shove all of this stuff into our shower here on the boat without impeding access to any of the other areas I'm going to be working on this week. I've been living aboard boats for the past decade or so, and the longer I live aboard boats, the more I start to get annoyed by the perpetual shuffling around of stuff. And it's not even that we have a bunch of unnecessary stuff, it's just there's a lot of big bulky stuff. Like, for instance, most of this is just sails. But alas, the aft cabin is now accessible. What we're going to be working on is the bottom of this and the back of this. As of right now, all of this is just painted fiberglass. By the end of this video, hopefully it'll all be covered in insulation and hidden behind a nice decorative plywood shell. I'm going to be insulating the aft cabin with this Armaflex knockoff product. It looks and feels exactly like the Armaflex I used for the rest of the boat. I just couldn't get the brand name variety here in Trinidad. I've used a bunch of Armaflex here aboard Athena to insulate the inside of the hull and under the deck, but all of that stuff was the peel and stick variety. This stuff doesn't have any adhesive on it. Now, I have a can of this 3M's Super 77 that I'm hoping I can use, but we should probably do a little test. I sprayed adhesive on the plywood and then waited until the adhesive was dry but tacky. I then smushed both of my samples down. I have 2 samples here. This one has adhesive on both the foam and the plywood, and the other one just has adhesive on the plywood. Now let's see which one is easiest to remove. It doesn't seem like it's important to apply spray adhesive to both of the surfaces, but it does seem like it's very important to wait until the adhesive is in fact dry. The sun is beating down in the cockpit and that's heating everything up a lot. So I think my safest course here is to wait until tonight when it's a little bit cooler to apply this stuff. But I can still go ahead and make the supports we need to actually hold the plywood shell in place. A hole saw made short work of cutting little circles of plywood. After a quick bit of cleanup to get rid of any sharp and pokey bits, I mixed up a little bit of epoxy. I filled the center holes with thickened epoxy and coated all of the sides of the circles with unthickened epoxy. While I had some epoxy mixed up, I also adhered the side of the nav station in place and filled the little top gap. Later that evening, the little plywood circles had cured enough that I could remove them from the plastic. Unfortunately, to get a good bond, I had to expose fresh fiberglass in the aft cabin, which of course means lots of itchy man glitter. With everything ready, I cut off a piece of insulation, sprayed adhesive on the surface, and started wrangling the insulation in place. If the adhesive ever fails, it's not the end of the world, as the plywood shell will be easy to remove. Using the same hole saw as earlier, I cut nice snug little holes for the plywood circles and adhered them in place with a generous helping of thickened epoxy. This is the plywood I got. This was sold as marine plywood. Now the term marine plywood has always frustrated me a little bit because it doesn't actually mean anything. Sure, you might assume that the plywood would be VPP glued, meaning the glue doesn't dissolve if it gets wet. You could also assume that maybe it has no voids internally, or maybe you could assume that it has a certain quality of surface finish. But all of those are just assumptions, right? Something being marine plywood doesn't actually mean anything. By that, I mean marine plywood is not a standard. At least looking at this plywood, it is APA stamped. It's Group 1 exterior. So at least I know it's not going to be crumbling apart if it gets wet. But looking at the surface finish on this plywood, it is kind of rough. There is a lot of wood grain texture to this surface here. To be completely honest, it looks more like sheeting plywood than anything else I've used aboard Athena. Now, fortunately, the little shell I'm going to be building is a relatively small area, so I can paint this, I can fair it and make it look nice that way. But yeah, for anything else, I would probably want a surface that's a little bit higher quality than this. I have absolutely no idea what kind of costs are associated with importing building materials into Trinidad, so I can't say if what I paid for this sheet of plywood was fair. And also we are on a small-ish island, so I would expect to pay a little bit of a premium. But yeah, I paid $147 US for this sheet of plywood. That's probably the worst price to performance ratio, at least when it comes to surface finish I've ever experienced. But to be fair, when I drilled out all of my little plywood circles, I didn't find any voids or any other imperfections. So yeah, it looks solid, just a little bit rough in the surface. I shoved the bottom piece of plywood into the aft cabin, got it smushed in place and secured with a couple of screws. I'll have to trim the length when I remove it, so I made a couple of marks for that. The side piece of plywood is a little bit of an organic shape, so I made a rough template to get me as close as possible. After a couple of minor adjustments, I finally had a nice snug fit. A little dab of thickened epoxy should do a great job of adhering the two pieces of plywood together. That way I can get the angle between the two pieces absolutely perfect, even with the limited tools I have aboard the boat. It is the next day, and as you can see, I have successfully extracted the beginnings of our shell here without the two pieces tearing apart. I've already trimmed the length of it. Now I just need to worry about the side. Once I get the side trimmed, I think I'm gonna add a a single layer of glass to that corner, because corners are always kind of fragile, and seeing as we're always gonna be shoving stuff in and out of the aft cabin, I think it's well worth the effort to just try and protect that corner a little bit. That is this corner down here, and as you can see, it is going to have an exposed edge of plywood, but the glass should do a good job of protecting that. Now, getting the corner here nicely rounded over is going to be a little bit of a challenge. Back in Denmark, I had the luxury of an adjustable base for my router, and I made a special little roundover bit that could deal with a slight bit of angle there. But yeah, I don't have that luxury here, so to get a nice smooth radius there, I'm just gonna have to freehand it. That's gonna be roughly the same process I used for rounding over the deck hull joint when I was fairing the hull before painting it, if you guys remember that far back. Of course, this is gonna be plywood, so it's probably gonna be a little bit more tricky to do, but we'll find out. I cut off the excess plywood with my oscillating multi-tool. Again, not the best tool for the job, but the only tool I have aboard. After a quick bit of sanding to clean up the edge, I put 2 lines on each side of the joint to act as a guide, and then remove the excess plywood with Mr. Angle Grinder. That broke the angle into 2, and then I used some 120 grit to round over those 2 edges. The result, as you can see here, was a spiffy, soft radius. Not too shabby considering the tools I have aboard the boat. I wetted out the plywood and waited 15 minutes before applying more epoxy, and then finally laid up the single layer of glass. After the epoxy started to gel, as you can see here, there's a lot of texture in the glass, so I went over it with another coat of epoxy. This is the result, a nice soft radius here. This is going to be really nice for bumping your head on, and it's also going to be pretty tough in case we're shoving stuff into the aft cabin and accidentally bump this. But the purpose of that second coat of epoxy was simply just to fill the texture of the glass a little bit, so that when I start sanding this, I'm not instantly removing that single layer of fiberglass. As you might be able to tell by the color of the wood here, I used a little bit of the excess epoxy to just wipe over the plywood. That means the grain of the wood should already have risen. That means once I've given this a light sanding, I should be able to get the first coat of primer on there without having the grain raise up a lot. Of course, because I used fiberglass tape, I have this annoying bump you always get when you use this stuff because of the way the tape is woven together. But a quick sanding and a quick lick of fairing compound should easily get rid of that. Not only did I get the first coat of primer on the plywood shell yesterday and a lick of fairing compound, I also got started on the corner of the nav station here. I primed underneath the sink area, and I also got started on the little edge over by the settee. This used to be just a bare plywood edge looking exactly like this piece here. And this was actually bothering me more than the nav station, but yeah, by the time I'm done, it'll be completely smooth and spiffy. Oh, yeah, and there's also these two shelves for the head here. These used to be just raw plywood. Ava's asked me to prime and paint these when I was busy priming and painting all of the other stuff. I ran out of polyester putty last night, so if you look at the shell here, there is an area over here where I haven't applied putty yet. And depending on the lighting and the camera, you might be able to see the texture of the wood over here. That is what I'm trying to get rid of. Now this side was primed. It has a lick of polyester putty on there and a light sanding. Now this is nice and smooth. This is fairly rough. If I had been able to get some plywood with a nicer surface finish to it, then of course I wouldn't have to bother with the polyester putty. But it is a small area, like I mentioned. The only thing I'm a little bit annoyed about is the fact that I don't have a vacuum for my sander, and sanding the polyester putty, it does generate an obscene amount of very fine dust. If the shell was a little bit smaller so I could get it out through the companionway, then I would bring it outside and sand it, but it's too big to fit, so my only option is to sand it inside of the boat. I'm fortunate in the fact that the videos are a few weeks behind real time right now. That means by the time Ava sees this video and all of the dust in here, I'll have had plenty of time to clean up my mess. So that should result in significantly less yelling. Before I get back to the Oh Glorious dust production, let's just adjust everybody's expectations in terms of the nav station here. Because although I can fair all of this out and have it look completely smooth and spiffy, I don't have the little trim ring yet that's going to go around the mini exotic dancer pole up here. I can have Ava bring one back from the US, I just don't have it yet. So even though all this will look nice and smooth, I don't have the little trim ring here yet. Over the next few days, I touched up a couple of imperfections, applied another coat of primer, before then finally moving on to the top coat. In between coats of perfection from Interlux, I sanded all of the surfaces with 320 grit sandpaper, and then, before I knew it, it was time for the final coat. And this is the result of my efforts, a nice shiny white plywood shell for the aft cabin. Now hopefully the insulation in there will make it a tiny bit more comfortable in terms of temperature, but certainly the white plywood shell should brighten up the aft cabin quite a bit. The nav station is looking like there was never ever a pair of very publicly shamed holes, one here and one down here. Everything is nice and smooth and bright white. Now, as you can see, I chose to remove this bottom piece of the nav station. That's simply just because I haven't fully decided on if I want to varnish this or if I want to paint it. but that will be a problem for an upcoming video. The edge over here is also looking nice, smooth and bright white. Basically, this area is now ready for me to put the trim back from last week's video. The area under the sink is also fully painted and ready to be reassembled. Last and also kind of least, I have the 3 little covers for the charging area down here on the side of the kitchen island. These are now ready for a bit of hardware and for a bit of installation. But let's start by getting the plywood shell installed in the aft cabin so we can free up some space here inside of the boat. Getting the shell in place and secured with a couple of screws was a breeze. The astute viewer might have noticed that there's an unseemly gap around the outside of the shell. I picked up a bit of teak from the woodworking workshop to hide the gap. I am so excited to at some point have access to a workshop again. It is fun chasing precision with the tool equivalent of a dull spoon, but it will also be awesome to have access to better tools and a better place to do the work. I used a little bit of 5-minute epoxy to adhere the trim pieces in place. There is some sanding to be done once the epoxy is cured, but the aft cabin is starting to look a lot better. One of the great joys of doing boat projects is being able to start putting everything back in place once the project is done, even if it is just our sliding IKEA garbage can. The hatches or covers for the charging area were easy to finish. A couple of holes and a dash of latch, and presto, we can now keep everything contained while sailing. Now that I was done with the exposed plywood edge over by the settee, I could finally put all of the trim from last week's video back in place, including the 2 pieces of trim that cover up the knees for the chain plates, and then also finally our temporary plywood headliner could be reinstalled. The boat is actually starting to look a lot like a boat again. That's very exciting. And like I mentioned, that exposed bit of plywood over by the settee, that had really been bothering me for a long time, so it's nice to see that looking all spiffy. The videos are currently a couple of weeks behind real time, and I just realized that this video will be coming out on Christmas Day, which means I've missed out on the opportunity to do a bunch of Santa-related humor in the video, but I guess that'll have to wait until next year. But I just wanted to take a second to wish all of you guys happy holidays, and I hope you get to have some nice family time and spend it with some people that you love. On a super duper positive note, I now have a bunch of tasks here that I can close. Finish the aft cabin. The only thing that's left to do in the aft cabin is basically put up headliner, but yeah, we still have the temporary headliner in place everywhere else, so that will wait until then. Then we have paint under the companionway, where I touched up a bit of paint. I don't think you guys saw that in the video, but I did that. And then we have paint under the galley and the head shelves. That is done too. And last but not least, or kind of least, the charging area doors or hatches or cover doohickeys. The nav station task, I can't really close that yet because I still have to figure out if I want to varnish or paint that bit of leg or whatever you want to call it. I would like to say that I'll finish the nav station in next week's video, but I don't think I will, because now that I remember that this is the Christmas video, that'll make next week's video the New Year's video. And traditionally for that video, I make kind of a year in review video where I summed up everything that happened in the last year and take a quick glimpse at our plans for the upcoming year. So I think that will be next week's video. But at least you guys can take solace in the fact that you can have Christmas without thinking about the unseemly hole that used to be here on the nav station. But like I said, I still need the little trim ring from the US, so we'll get back to that. Now, that's going to be the end of this week's video. I hope to see all of you guys back here aboard Athena next week for hopefully a year in review video. And as always, feel free to leave a comment down below, and don't forget, if you've enjoyed this video, please remember to leave a like. See you!